My name is Margaret Preston, and I watched my sister lock our grandfather's house and smile. That's how betrayal looks when it comes dressed in black after a funeral calm, polite practiced. The wind was still carrying the scent of lilies from the church when she turned the key, a thin click that sounded louder than any prayer that day. Neighbors lingered on the sidewalk pretending not to look, but everyone knew what that door meant. It was the end of something that used to hold us all together. The house sat on the corner of Maple and Fifth, white siding, faded to cream porch swing, rusted, but still steady. Grandpa built it in 1948 with his own hands, oak beams, heartwood floors, a fireplace that never went cold even when the world outside did. He used to say, "This fire is our family, Margaret. You keep it burning, and it'll keep you." I believed him. Maybe I still do. The week of his funeral felt like living inside a dream you couldn't wake from. People came and went, dropping casseroles like offerings, saying the same phrases. He lived a long life. He's in a better place. But the only place I wanted him to be was in his chair by that fireplace, humming along with the radio, tapping his cane in rhythm. Every corner of that house breathed him. Elaine arrived late to the funeral heels, clicking on the church tile, sunglasses on, though it was cloudy. She'd been gone for years. Chicago, then Cincinnati, always chasing promotions and forgetting birthdays. I didn't expect her to stay long this time either. But when the lawyer called us 2 days later, she was the first to show up, dressed like she'd stepped out of a magazine, lipstick perfect, smile thin. We sat across from each other in the lawyer's office, a room that smelled of dust and ink. He read the will aloud, words that sliced through the silence. I, Thomas Preston, leave my home and property at 201 Maple Street to my granddaughter, Elaine Preston. I thought I'd misheard. For 20 years, I'd lived just down the street, cared for Grandpa when his eyesight failed, cooked his meals, paid his bills when the pension didn't stretch far enough. Elaine had visited twice a year, once at Christmas, once when she needed to feel generous. My throat burned, but I said nothing. I just watched her sign the papers, thanking the lawyer like she'd won a prize. That evening, she walked me to the porch. "You know Maggie," she said. Using the nickname she only used when she wanted something, "I'll take good care of it." I looked at her, at the way her hand trembled just a little as she slid the key into the lock. The setting sun caught in her hair made her look softer for a second. Then she smiled. That small, satisfied smile. And the door clicked shut. I stood there long after she drove away. The porch light flickered, and a moth kept circling it, bumping against the glass like it didn't understand it couldn't get inside. Maybe that was me. Maybe I was still hoping for a light that didn't belong to me anymore. The next morning, I walked past the house on my way to work at the diner. The curtains were already different, new ones, pale blue. Her car was gone, but the mailbox was full of glossy catalogs and a welcome letter from a home insurance company. She'd wasted no time claiming it as hers. I wanted to feel angry, but what I felt was empty, like the house itself had pushed me out. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing Grandpa's voice. "Keep the fire, Maggie. Don't let it go cold." So I got dressed, drove to Maple Street, and sat in my car across from the house. The moon was bright enough to show the curtains moving in the draft. I thought I saw a faint orange glow behind the windows, like someone had lit the fireplace. But I knew that wasn't possible. Elaine hadn't even moved in yet. Still, the light flickered once, twice, then vanished. The next day, I told myself I'd imagined it. I poured coffee, went to work, smiled for customers. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that house, the door, the key, the smile. I started thinking, maybe revenge doesn't come like thunder. Maybe it starts quiet like an ember waiting for air. On Sunday, I went back again, this time in daylight. I stood on the sidewalk pretending to check my phone, but my eyes were fixed on the porch. The wind blew through the chimes Grandpa hung years ago, the ones shaped like tiny church bells. They played a tune I hadn't heard since childhood. I don't know why, but it made me laugh through tears. Because even with the door locked, the house still knew my name. That evening, when the sun dipped low and the sky turned copper, I whispered to the wind, "You can lock the door, Elaine, but you can't lock what's inside." And maybe, just maybe, the fire inside those walls heard me. I remember when that house wasn't a wound, but a heartbeat. Before paperwork and lawyers and locked doors, it was just two little girls running through the yard while Grandpa stacked wood for winter. The scent of sawdust and cider hung in the air, and the world was small enough to fit inside one glowing window. Elaine and I were close once, or at least I thought we were. She was older by 3 years, sharper in every way, her handwriting perfect, her voice confident. Grandpa used to wink at me and say, "Don't try to outshine her, Maggie. Just keep your fire steady." I didn't know what he meant back then, but I do now. Elaine burned quick. I burned long. We grew up in that house through every season. Snow drifts against the porch rail, lightning bugs on humid nights, and the smell of rain through the old screen door. Grandpa built us a tree swing in the backyard, tied with ropes so thick you could swing into the wind and feel like you'd never touch ground again. When we fought, he'd send us outside to let the air settle. It always worked. Until we grew up. Elaine left for college, then for the city. She stopped coming home except on holidays, breezing in with gifts that looked expensive and stories that made Mom uncomfortable. I stayed in Indiana, married young, divorced quietly. When our parents passed, I moved closer to Grandpa to help out. He was still strong then, but his eyesight had started to fade, and I could tell he was afraid of losing the independence he'd fought for all his life. Those years were simple, not easy, but honest. Every morning, I'd bring him coffee in the chipped mug with the red barn on it. We'd sit on that porch talking about nothing, corn prices, the pastor's new sermon, how the mailman was driving too fast down Maple Street. Elaine would call once in a while, loud and distant through the speakerphone, always ending the same way. "I'll visit soon." But soon stretched for years. When Grandpa's health worsened, I became his caretaker full-time. The doctors said his heart was weak, but it was really his eyes that scared him. He couldn't read the newspaper anymore, couldn't see to sign checks. I handled his bills, cooked his meals, drove him to appointments. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt right. He'd raised us with stories about duty and kindness, and now it was my turn to give some of that back. Elaine finally showed up the spring before he died. She brought flowers and a new phone for him, one with buttons too small for his hands. She stayed a weekend long enough to make promises she wouldn't keep. Still, Grandpa was happy just to hear her laughter echo through the hallway again. He loved us both, maybe equally, but he loved me in the daily ways, the quiet kind that doesn't need to be said aloud. I remember one night that summer, the last time we all sat together. The storm had knocked the power out. We lit candles, and Grandpa started talking about the fireplace. "You girls know why I built that hearth first?" he asked. Elaine shrugged. "Because you like fire." He chuckled. "Because you build warmth before walls. Walls are easy to raise, but warmth takes tending. Never forget that." Elaine rolled her eyes. I didn't. I was watching the firelight move across his face, memorizing it without realizing why. The weeks after that blurred into hospital visits and whispered prayers. When he passed, it was peaceful. I held his hand, told him I'd keep everything just as he left it. I thought I would. But grief has a way of turning promises into paper. The day we cleared out his things, Elaine showed up with boxes and a camera crew from her real estate company. She said she wanted to document the property for records. I wanted to tell her to stop, but I didn't want another argument. She took photos of the rooms like they were assets, not memories. When I looked through his desk later, I found stacks of unpaid bills, and on top of them, a note written in his shaky hand. For Maggie, she keeps the fire. It wasn't notarized, not legal, just love on lined paper. I folded it carefully, put it in my wallet, and haven't taken it out since. After the funeral, when Elaine locked the door and smiled, that note was the only thing that stopped me from screaming. Because in a strange way, I realized she could take the house, but she couldn't take what it meant. She didn't understand the work behind those walls or the warmth that built them. Still, the silence afterward was heavy. Every time I passed that block, I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. The diner, the grocery store, even church felt smaller. People whispered sympathy that sounded like pity. Margaret, dear, you did so much for him. Yes, I'd say. And now I have nothing to show for it. But that wasn't entirely true. I still had his camera, the old Polaroid that had survived birthdays, graduation, storms. He used to call it the keeper of light. It was sitting on my kitchen table, dusty and patient waiting. One night, I picked it up and pressed the shutter. The picture slid out slowly gray at first, then faint shapes emerging the fireplace at Maple Street, burning bright. I hadn't been there. No one had. But the image was clear. The fire was alive. I stared at it for a long time, the heat I couldn't feel glowing through memory alone. That's when I realized Grandpa was right. Some fires don't need wood to burn. They just need someone who refuses to let them go cold. The next week, I couldn't stop thinking about that photograph, the one that showed a fire I hadn't lit in a house I couldn't enter. It sat on my table like a question that refused to fade. Every time I walked past it, the colors seemed to deepen the orange glow, the shadows on the brick, the faint outline of the old rocking chair. At first, I thought maybe I'd accidentally taken it months ago. Maybe it had just developed late, but the Polaroid film had expired years back. It shouldn't have worked at all. And yet, there it was. On Tuesday, I drove to town to pick up groceries and found myself turning toward the old law office instead. The same one where Elaine had signed the papers that took the house. The lawyer, Mr. Kendrick, was a man in his 70s with watery eyes and a voice that still carried authority. He remembered me right away. "Miss Preston," he said gently, "how are you holding up?" I told him the truth, that I wasn't angry, just unsettled, that I couldn't make sense of how the house ended up in Elaine's name. He sighed and gestured toward a cabinet full of files. "It was all in order. Legally speaking," he said. "Your grandfather signed the transfer, dated it himself. But he could barely see by then," I said. "He couldn't even read the newspaper." He hesitated, then nodded. "I know, but the signature matches. If she..." Persuaded him that's something the law can't untangle after the fact. I thanked him and left my hands shaking. It wasn't about money or property anymore. It was about truth. I'd cared for Grandpa when no one else did. And now his story, our story, had been rewritten without me. That night, I took the Polaroid out again. I turned it under the lamp, studying every detail. Then I saw something I hadn't noticed before on the mantel above the fire. Half hidden in shadow was a small framed photo of me and Grandpa on his 80th birthday. The one Elaine had packed away after he passed. A chill ran through me. That picture had been locked inside the house. I decided to test it. I took another photo this time, pointing the camera at the dark window of my apartment. The film developed slowly, the soft whirring sound, filling the silence. When the colors came in, I saw not my reflection, but the outline of the old Maple Street porch, faint and distant, like a memory bleeding through. The next morning, I drove back to Maple Street. The grass was overgrown already, and a private property sign leaned crooked against the fence. I stood there for a long time, camera in hand, the wind tugging at my jacket. The house looked asleep. Not empty, just waiting. I walked to the porch steps, stopped short of the door. I could almost hear Grandpa humming behind the walls the tune he'd always used when fixing things. I aimed the camera again and pressed the button. Click. The photo slid out warm. I tucked it in my coat pocket and walked away before it could finish developing. I didn't need answers yet. I needed courage to look. Back home, I laid out the two photos side by side. In the new one, the fire was gone. But in its place, faint and smudged, was the silhouette of someone standing at the window. I thought at first it might be Elaine, but the posture, the slope of the shoulders, looked too much like Grandpa. That night, I dreamed of the house again. I was standing by the fireplace, the air thick with wood smoke and memory. Grandpa sat in his chair, smiling. "It's not about the walls, Maggie," he said softly. "It's about who remembers to tend the flame." I woke with tears on my face and the smell of smoke in my hair. The next day, I packed a small box of his things, the pocket knife, his old work gloves, and the church bulletin from his funeral, and drove to the town library. I didn't know what else to do, but I needed to keep his name alive somehow. The librarian, Mrs. Hart, was a kind widow who'd lost her husband the same year Grandpa passed. She listened while I explained that I wanted to start a story circle just once a week for locals to share memories of the old days. She smiled, nodded, and said she'd reserve a corner of the reading room. The first week only 3 people came, a retired teacher, a farmer's wife, and a quiet man who used to work at the post office. We sat around a small table with instant coffee and told stories. They weren't grand or fancy, just real. By the second week, 10 people showed up. By the third, we had to move to a bigger table. I didn't talk about Elaine or the house, but every story I told somehow circled back to Grandpa, the lessons he'd taught, the kindness he'd shown, the simple wisdom he carried. I realized I didn't need a roof to keep his legacy alive. One afternoon after the session, a woman approached me. "You're Thomas Preston's granddaughter, aren't you?" she asked. "He used to bring me apples from his yard, said no one should go through a day without something sweet." I smiled. That sounds like him. When she left, I sat alone for a while, the late sun pouring through the window like firelight. I took the Polaroid from my purse and snapped a picture of the empty chairs, the light, the quiet space that felt so full. The photo developed with a faint orange hue, like there was a flame still flickering somewhere in the corner. That's when I realized revenge didn't always mean destruction. Sometimes it meant remembering when others forgot. Sometimes it meant keeping the fire alive even if you had to carry it alone. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. I began carrying Grandpa's Polaroid with me everywhere, tucked inside my purse, beside the folded note he'd written me. "For Maggie. She keeps the fire." By late June, the Indiana air was thick and humming with heat. The town was quiet in that slow, small-town way that makes every sound matter. A screen door creak, a mower sputtering somewhere down the street, a train wailing past the cornfields. I'd just finished another story circle at the library when I felt that tug again, the same pull that kept leading me back to Maple Street. I told myself I only wanted to see how the place was holding up. But the truth was simpler. I missed him. I missed belonging somewhere. When I reached the house, storm clouds were stacking over the horizon. The air smelled of rain and memory. The private property sign was still there, half fallen, the paint beginning to peel. I stepped onto the porch, laid my hand against the doorframe. The wood was warm. Lightning cracked across the sky. The first drops hit hard and fast. Then came the wind, sharp, twisting, strong enough to shove the front door inward. The latch must have loosened. I hesitated only a second before stepping inside. The air was thick with the smell of damp and dust. Furniture was covered with white sheets, like ghosts waiting to be named. My shoes left wet prints across the floorboards. Everything was quieter than I remembered, but underneath the silence, the house still breathed. Water dripped from the ceiling onto the rug. I followed it toward the fireplace where a thin leak had made a dark line down the brick. I couldn't help myself. I knelt and ran my fingers over the old soot. "I'm just here to keep you safe a little longer," I whispered. Half to Grandpa, half to the house itself, half to the... Another flash of lightning, and the power somewhere in the distance flickered. Instinctively, I reached for the Polaroid and pressed the shutter. Click! The flash burst, lighting the whole room for an instant. When the image developed, it showed the room exactly as it was, except the fire was burning again. Not bright, not wild, just a steady glow, as if someone had built it carefully moments before I arrived. I looked up at the hearth. It was empty. Only ashes cold and gray. The roof creaked, and rain began to pour harder. I found a tarp in the pantry closet, spread it over the leaky section, and set a pot underneath. Then I sat in Grandpa's chair for the first time since the funeral. The cushions sighed under my weight, familiar as a held breath. I stayed there a long while, listening to the storm pound against the windows. Outside, the trees bent like they were bowing to something greater. Inside, I could almost hear him again. Warmth before walls. Maggie. Always warmth before walls. When the rain finally eased, I stood, dried my hands on my jeans, and looked around one last time. Everything felt suspended, like the past was still deciding whether to let me go. That's when headlights flashed through the window. A car door slammed. Elaine? She ran up the porch, her hair plastered to her face, her heels sinking into the mud. "What are you doing here?" she shouted over the rain. "You can't just come in." "I was checking for leaks," I said quietly. "The storm. I don't need you to fix my house." "Our house," I corrected before I could stop myself. Her expression tightened. "You think you're the only one who loved him?" I wanted to say no, but the words tangled in my throat. She stepped closer. Eyes wet, whether from rain or tears I couldn't tell. "You had all his time," she said. "All those years with him. I just wanted something that proved I was still part of this family." Her voice cracked on the word family. For the first time, I saw the loneliness behind her anger, the same kind I'd carried for months. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the Polaroid from earlier, and handed it to her. "Look." She frowned at the photo, then gasped. "That's impossible." The fire in the picture glowed softly, filling the room behind her. I didn't explain. I didn't have to. She sank into Grandpa's chair, staring at the image like it held all the words she'd never said. We sat there in silence while the rain eased into a steady drip from the gutters. For once, neither of us was trying to win. We were just two sisters in the wreckage of a storm, holding proof that something still burned between us. After a while, she whispered, "I don't deserve it, but maybe the house was never really mine anyway." I looked at her, tired but calm. Maybe it never belonged to either of us. Maybe it just needed someone to remember. When I left that night, she didn't stop me. She only said, "Leave the key on the porch, okay?" I nodded and placed it on the railing, where Grandpa used to rest his coffee cup. The air smelled of wet cedar and smoke. Driving home, I felt something loosen in me, not forgiveness yet, but the space where it could grow. That night, as I undressed for bed, I found the note in my pocket again. The edges were worn, the ink smudged from my fingers, but the words were still there. She keeps the fire. I set it beside the Polaroid on my nightstand. The photograph had changed. The fire was smaller now, gentler, but it was still there, steady as a heartbeat. The storm had passed, but something in me stayed restless. For days after that night, I kept seeing the house in my mind, its soaked shingles, the flicker of imagined firelight, Elaine's trembling hands holding that impossible photograph. I thought she'd call, but she didn't. We'd spoken without really saying goodbye, and maybe that was enough for now. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that the story wasn't over. When I went back to the library that week, the reading circle felt different. People lingered after asking about Grandpa again. One woman said, "It's funny how houses carry echoes, isn't it? Like they keep breathing even after everyone's gone." I nodded. Maybe that's their way of remembering us. Later that afternoon, thunder rumbled again far off low like a warning. The weatherman on the diner TV said a new system was coming, the biggest one of the summer. I laughed to myself. Indiana never ran out of storms. That night, the rain returned harder than before. The power flickered, and the apartment felt too small, too quiet. I stared at the Polaroids on my table, the glowing fire, the blurred window, the faint silhouette that looked like Grandpa. Then my phone buzzed. Elaine. Her message was short. "The roof's leaking again. I can't get there till tomorrow. Can you check?" I stared at the screen, half shocked she'd even asked. Maybe she'd remembered how I'd patched it before. Maybe she just couldn't face that house alone. Either way, I grabbed my coat and the camera and drove through the rain. The wipers fought to keep up. The road shimmered under lightning, and the fields on either side looked like dark water. When I reached Maple Street, the gutters overflowed, and the air smelled like wet soil and pine. The door creaked open when I touched it, just like before. Inside, water dripped from the ceiling in heavy, steady beats. The white sheets covering the furniture were soaked, clinging to the shapes beneath. I lit a lantern from the old pantry and set it by the hearth. The room glowed amber shadows, stretching long. For reasons I can't explain, I picked up a few logs from the basket and built a small fire. The wood hissed as it caught, sending curls of smoke into the chimney. The warmth spread quickly, chasing the chill from the air. When the flames steadied, I sat on the floor and took out the Polaroid. Click. The flash popped, echoing through the room. The photo came out, slow colors fading in like a secret being revealed. Two shapes appeared beside the fire. Two little girls. One holding a Polaroid camera, the other clutching a teddy bear with one ear missing. I felt my throat close. That was us, me and Elaine. The swing ropes behind us, the same ones Grandpa had tied decades ago. The photo trembled in my hands. I looked toward the fireplace, nothing but crackling logs, but the warmth in the room deepened, rich and steady. It wasn't frightening. It felt like permission. Rain beat harder against the roof, and I thought of Grandpa again. Warmth before walls. Maybe this was what he'd meant, how you tend to the warmth even when the walls around you start to fall apart. When the storm finally eased, I left the fire burning low and stepped out onto the porch. The world was washed clean, the sky that pale gray before dawn. Across the street, the maples dripped and shone like silver. I could almost see him there, his figure steady in the mist, had tipped that patient half smile that always made me feel like everything would be all right. A car pulled up behind me. Elaine. She climbed the steps, soaked but calm this time. "I didn't think you'd come," she said softly. "You asked." She looked inside at the fire, then at the photo still in my hand. "You built it again?" "Yes," I said. "But maybe it was never out." She hesitated, then stepped past me into the room. The firelight painted her face gold. For a moment, she looked like the sister I remembered, the one who swung high into the air and believed the world was hers. "I thought if I owned this place, it would make me feel close to him," she whispered. "But it doesn't. It just reminds me how far I went." I didn't say anything. She looked at the Polaroid in my hand and smiled sadly. "He'd like that you kept taking pictures. He'd like that you came back." She sank into Grandpa's old chair, pulling the blanket from the armrest around her shoulders. "It smells like him," she said quietly. Outside, the thunder rolled one last time before fading into distance. Inside, only the soft hiss of the fire remained. We sat there until morning. The storm had stripped everything down, trees, roof, walls, but somehow it left us lighter. Elaine watched the fire until her eyes drifted closed. When the first light crept through the curtains, I reached for the Polaroid one last time and took a picture of her sleeping there, peaceful for once. When it developed, the fireplace behind her glowed bright, almost white. I turned the photo over and wrote in small letters, "For Elaine, keep the fire." Then I left it on the mantel. As I walked out, I paused at the doorway. The air was warm again, dry and clean. For the first time in months, the house didn't feel like it belonged to her or to me, but to something bigger. Sometimes revenge isn't loud. Sometimes it's the quiet act of keeping watch while the world mends itself. And that morning, as I locked the door behind me, I realized the fire didn't need me anymore. It had found its own way to stay alive. The week after the storm, the town was soaked and quiet, like everything had taken a deep breath and finally exhaled. I didn't hear from Elaine for several days. I assumed she was cleaning up, maybe even repairing the roof. I didn't plan on going back. I thought that night by the fire had been our ending. But endings, I've learned, don't always announce themselves. They just change shape. One evening, I came home from the diner to find a letter wedged under my door. No envelope, just folded notebook paper, the kind we used to use for school notes. The handwriting was unmistakable. "Maggie, I'm sorry for everything. I thought having the house would make me feel closer to him, but it only made me feel farther from you. Can you come by tomorrow? I want to show you something. Elaine." I almost didn't go. My heart said she might be trying to make peace. My pride told me I'd already made mine. But curiosity won, as it always does with sisters. The next morning, the sky was the color of pewter. Soft, still waiting. When I turned onto Maple Street, I saw the house before I even parked. The porch had been swept clean. The private property sign was gone. And something new hung by the door. Grandpa's wind chimes polished and shining. Elaine opened the door before I knocked. She looked different. No makeup, hair loose, tired, but calm. "You came," she said simply. "I got your letter." She stepped aside. "Come in, please." The air smelled of lemon oil and wood smoke. The fireplace was burning again, small but steady. Around the room, the white sheets were gone, replaced by fresh curtains and framed photos, our parents' grandpa, even one of the two of us as kids in the backyard. "I started unpacking his boxes," she said. "I found more of his letters. He wrote to both of us. I think he meant for us to share this place." She handed me one. The paper trembled between our fingers. "To my girls, keep the house if you want, but don't keep it from each other. There's no home in that." I read it twice, the ink blurred from years of folding. My throat felt tight. He always knew I whispered. Elaine smiled, faintly. "He did." I just didn't listen. She turned to the mantel where the Polaroid I'd left for her sat in a small wooden frame. The words, "For Elaine, keep the fire," were still visible at the bottom. "I think I'm ready to make it right," she said. "I've talked to the County Historical Board. They're willing to preserve the house as a local landmark in his name. Maybe as a small museum, maybe a storytelling space." I blinked. "You'd really do that?" She nodded. "We can call it the Preston House. You could run the story circle here if you want." For the first time in years, I didn't feel that old ache between us. I felt warmth like the house itself was exhaling relief. We spent the rest of the day sorting boxes, laughing over forgotten things, the cracked mug Grandpa used for his coffee, the worn gloves he never threw away, the Polaroids I'd taken long ago, birthdays, holidays, the fire burning through it all. At dusk, we sat on the porch steps as the sky turned amber. The air was cool, clean, and full of crickets. I realized I hadn't felt this peaceful in a long time. "You know, Elaine said I always thought you were stronger than me. Turns out you were just steadier. You kept showing up." I smiled. "Someone had to keep the fire." She laughed softly. "I guess you did." When I drove home later, the house glowed in my rearview mirror, warm, alive, the kind of light you only see from places built with love. Over the next few months, everything changed, slowly but surely. The Preston House opened as a community space that fall. Every Thursday evening, folks from town gathered there for stories and coffee, just like at the library, but now surrounded by the history that made those stories matter. Elaine handled the paperwork and tours. I ran the story circle. We worked side by side, not perfectly, but with care. One night, as we were locking up, I noticed the Polaroid camera sitting on the mantel. I picked it up and aimed it at the fire. "For old time's sake," I said. Click. When the film developed, we both leaned in. The picture showed the two of us standing by the hearth, arms crossed, faint smiles, light dancing around us. Neither of us remembered posing. "Do you think it's," she began. I shook my head. "No. I think it's us. Finally." We stood there a while longer, listening to the crackle of the flames and the soft rattle of Grandpa's chimes outside. For the first time, silence didn't feel like distance. It felt like peace. Winter came early that year, the kind that settled over Indiana like a heavy quilt. The sky stayed pale for weeks, the ground frozen under a thin crust of snow, and the smell of wood smoke drifted through town from every chimney. At the diner, regulars would stomp their boots and talk about the Preston sisters, the fire women some called us now, half joking, half respectful. The house had taken on a life of its own. The Preston House was open every Thursday and Saturday, sometimes Sundays, when the church group brought their pies. People came not just to look, but to sit in the chairs by the fire under the rafters. Grandpa had built himself. We told stories, laughed, even cried. Some folks brought old photos. Others just came to listen. Elaine and I worked together better than I ever thought possible. She handled donations and phone calls. I handled people. The two of us found a rhythm that felt almost like forgiveness. But even forgiveness needs tending. One Thursday evening, as the last guests were leaving, Elaine lingered by the fire. The orange light warmed her face, but her eyes looked far away. "I've been thinking," she said quietly, "about selling the house." I turned to her, startled. "What?" "Not soon," she said quickly, "but maybe someday. A developer offered to buy the land, wants to build senior housing. It'd be named after Grandpa, of course. They'd keep the fireplace." I didn't answer right away. The fire cracked softly between us, the sound of sap bursting in the logs. "You can't sell memory, Elaine," I said finally. She sighed. "I know. But we can't live in memory either." Something in me ached, not anger this time, just sadness. Maybe we don't live in it, I said, but it lives in us. That's enough. She smiled faintly. You always talk like a preacher. You know that someone has to keep you honest. We both laughed, and the tension eased. The moment passed like a gust of wind through the chimes outside, brief but real. A few days later, the first heavy snow arrived. The house looked like something from a Christmas card, soft light glowing through frosted windows. We planned a winter story night, and half the town showed up, farmers in plaid jackets, teachers, kids with pink cheeks from the cold. I watched from near the hearth as Elaine told her first story, a short one about Grandpa fixing the roof after a blizzard in '89. She stumbled, a little, laughed at herself, and the crowd laughed with her. Seeing her like that unpolished reel made something inside me finally rest. After the guests left, we sat by the fire again. Outside, the snow fell steady and soundless. Inside, the flames made the walls glow like honey. I think he'd be proud, Elaine said softly. He already is, I said. She leaned back, eyes closing, listening to the crackle. You know, I still feel him here sometimes. Maybe he never left. She smiled at that. You really believe that? I nodded. I don't think fires like his ever go out. The next morning I went back early to tend the fireplace. The house was still and cold, the ashes gray. On the mantel, the Polaroid camera sat waiting. I don't even remember setting it there the night before. I loaded a new film pack, just one left, and took a picture of the empty room, the cold hearth, the quiet morning light. When the photo developed, my breath caught. The fire was lit again, and sitting in Grandpa's chair was his old hat, creased, familiar, impossible. I walked over, half expecting it to vanish, but the chair was empty. Only the faint scent of cedar lingered in the air. When Elaine arrived later, I showed her the picture. She stared at it for a long time before whispering, "He's telling us it's time. Time for what to let go." She smiled, then not sad this time, but sure. That spring, we turned the Preston house over to the Town Historical Society. The last night before the transfer, we invited everyone who'd ever come to share one final story. The fire burned bright. Laughter filled every corner. I stood by the doorway watching faces glow in the light, and I thought of all the ways a home could survive through warmth, through memory, through the people who keep showing up. When the last guest left, I stayed behind alone. The fire was burning low, and the Polaroid lay on the table beside Grandpa's note. I took one last picture. Click. This time, the photo showed the hearth empty, just soft gray ash, and a single coal glowing faintly in the center. I smiled. That was enough. I locked the door and stepped outside. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels earned. Snow was gone. The ground smelled of earth and spring. The wind chimes swayed gently, playing a tune I hadn't heard since childhood. I whispered, "Thank you," and for a heartbeat, I could almost hear his voice. "Keep the fire. Maggie." Driving home, I thought about everything we'd lost and everything we'd managed to keep. Revenge had never been about taking something back. It was about refusing to forget, about tending what others tried to bury. At my apartment, I placed the last Polaroid on the table beside the old camera. The glow in that small ember was still there, stubborn and alive. I turned off the lights, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. "Some fires keep burning," I whispered to the dark, "no matter how many doors you close." And somewhere in that old house on Maple Street, I knew the fire was still burning, steady, patient, eternal. If this story touched you, share it with someone who's ever lost a piece of home, and remind them what's built in love never truly dies.